Dr. Keith Knudsen is here to share with us some of his discoveries and some of the innovation in breast cancer vaccine immunotherapy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Knudsen. Keith is here.
Wow, that's tough to follow that for sure. Well, thank you for being here today, and I appreciate the opportunity to be one of the first speakers talking about some of the developments that we've been pursuing in the laboratory over the past 15 to 20 years at the Mayo Clinic, and particularly the development of breast cancer vaccines, which is one part. You're going to hear another talk next on CAR T-cell therapy, which is another form of immunotherapy. We're really in this novel era of repositioning how we think of the treatment of cancer. Before we had the three pillars. There was surgery and chemotherapy and radiation. And 20 years ago, I was in Orlando here at the convention center, not this convention center, but the large convention center in Orlando. And my topic was immunotherapy, but back then that wasn't thought of as a pillar, nor was there any great, interest taken in immunotherapy. And as a result, if you've ever been to this conference center, it's, a couple of miles long, and they would always put us at the very back. And I still remember walking, as a junior investigator all the way to the back and thinking, wow, is what I'm doing really important? And it really made me think about the approaches I was taking. But I'm happy to say that today the immunotherapy is one of the four pillars of cancer therapy, and that's due to the work of many individuals, not only at the Mayo Clinic, which was very instrumental in some of the discoveries being used today, but across the world, and the persistence of the tumor immunologists that have, so passionately and committed their careers to the development of a strategy which is only in its infancy with respect to therapeutic applications. So I have some conflicts of interest. One of the most important things is, as we think through and develop the strategies that we want to take to the next level, we develop them in the laboratory, we discover them in the laboratory, we need to partner early on with the small biotech companies, because as scientists in our laboratory, we don't know all the nuances of what goes on in New York, for example, in the stock market and everything. And this is really important, particularly in the type of economy that we have to work. We have one small company that has purchased the technologies that I'm going to talk about today, or part of the technologies, Tapimune, and they've been working in partnership with the Mayo to develop some of these vaccine approaches, which aren't approved for therapy yet, but really represent, we hope, a foundation for the future of treating and preventing breast cancer. And there's also some other companies that I deal with respect to transferring some technology that they could potentially use ultimately in their products. So our group, and that's what I'm going to talk about, but keep in mind that immunotherapy covers a vast range of different strategies, a vast range of different technologies, and you will read about these. You will hear commercials on CNN, you will hear commercials on Fox about the development of immunotherapies. There's a wide variety, and so I'll be available to answer some questions. We're also going to hear, as I had mentioned, CAR T-cell therapy. Our focus has been on breast and ovarian cancers. Today I'm going to talk mostly about our work in breast cancer. I'm going to talk about the development of vaccines. The idea is just as the same as the idea of vaccines for the prevention of infectious diseases. We want to develop vaccines that prevent breast cancer. Breast cancer is, as I like to put it, a huge industry in the US that's costing us billions and billions of dollars. If you think about, in the United States, we have 240,000 cases per year. You extrapolate that to the world, we have, essentially, several million cases per year that lead to greater than 500,000 deaths per year, 650,000 this last year, 40,000 of those in the United States. And if I estimate it, you'll see varying estimates. You'll see estimates between 40 and 70 billion dollars. But if you use the Swedish model, which incorporates everything that accounts for the cost of breast cancer treatment and monitoring and deaths, loss of productivity, I estimate that we spend probably about 1% of our gross domestic product on breast cancer. That's got to stop. And we are thinking of a number of ways that we can stop that, and that's through the prevention of recurrence, which is the leading cause of death and development of metastasis. But even more recently, we've been working with the FDA and large advocacy organizations to develop the first breast cancer prevention vaccine, which I'll talk about in the end. So, the immune system. Okay, so I guess it was about 8 years ago, we had redesigned the medical school curriculum at Mayo Clinic when I was up in Rochester. And I was charged at that time with the establishing the immunology program. Immunology has a wide array of diseases associated. It's very important in the health of an individual, not only to protect against infectious diseases, but also very important in wound healing and inflammation and cancer, as you will see. And so by the time I was done, that was 36 hours of lecturing to medical students, and probably more, considering that a lot of them came to my office asking me questions about things that they didn't understand. I'm going to try to do that here in about 1 minute. And I understand that this is a very complex topic, but there's two arms to the immune system. Your immune system is your body's drug-making machinery. And we aren't making drugs, we are making reagents that your immune system can use to train itself to make the drugs that it needs to combat cancer. That's the idea. Your immune system is your body's own natural defenses. It can make, so think of this number, 1 times 10 to the 18th, if you know anything about, scientific notation, so 18 zeros. So that's how many different drugs your body's immune system can make. And it does that through genetic rearrangements and all of these novel, protein switching machineries that are very difficult to explain in a very short period of time, but ultimately results in this vast repertoire of different proteins that can bind to different things. It can bind to flu. It can bind to measles. It can bind to polio. It can bind to cancer. It's your body's natural drug-making machinery, and that's what the development of immunotherapies is to harness that capability, because we know that it's an extremely powerful system. If you think about somebody, if you've ever known anybody that's had a transplant, think about how fast your immune system can reject an organ from another individual through activation of the immune response. Think about all of these nasty diseases that your body can fight through, and it does by making these drugs and attacking whatever that is. Sometimes the organisms that we encounter in the environment get the better of us, but the vast majority of the time you're exposed to microorganisms that are pathogenic, but your immune system is absolutely incredible. There's multiple arms to the immune system, and we particularly focus on helper T cells, and I'm not going to go into all of the immunology here, but you have antibodies. So if some of you are familiar with breast cancer, there's an antibody used to treat breast cancer, Herceptin. Okay, that's derived from the immune system. We just purify it in large amounts, put it in a vial, and we deliver it to individuals to treat their breast cancer. Your body can produce those antibodies. We just have to figure out ways to train your body to produce those antibodies. And there's special cells in your body that we call T cells. And the T cells can help immune responses, or they can actually directly encounter and kill tumor cells. We focus on really the central mediator of the immune response, which is the helper T cell response, because we want to develop vaccines that can train your immune system to develop immunity to continually seek and destroy cancer when you don't have cancer. Just like we give you a vaccine for the flu every year, so, and this year didn't really work that well, but we give you one so that we can train your immune system to look for the flu in your body and get rid of it right away before you get sick. Measles, mumps, rubella, tetanus, polio. These are the diseases that we train your immune system to combat. And each response to these vaccines is absolutely specific. And it's this power, the specificity of the immune system that we're trying to harness in order to attack cancer. And that leads to a safe product. This is unlike chemotherapy and radiation, where we try to hone in and get it to attack the cancer, but oftentimes it leads to some pretty dramatic side effects. And typically, the immune system doesn't do that. So we know from our experience with vaccines, we don't have a lot of problems with vaccines. I mean, we have some problems, and you'll see those published in the literature sometimes, but we don't have a lot of problems. The benefit from vaccines far outweighs the risks associated with vaccines. So we started this many, many, many years ago. In fact, immunotherapy goes back to probably the early 1900s. But in recent times, this is just a study showing if your body produces T cells that can get into the tumor, you survive longer. So this is what we call a Kaplan-Meier curve. So if this graph here, is got a steep slope and it goes all the way down to the bottom of the graph, that means your disease is more pathologic. So we divided individuals up into, this is not my study, this is a study from another group, but clearly demonstrates that if you have T cell immunity, which are these two groups here, they have far better outcomes. In fact, 75% of individuals with T cell responses survive long term in this study, relative to 30 or 40% of individuals that didn't have those T cell responses. We know that immunity, both in the tumor and in the blood, leads to improved survival. We need to do something about that. And what we do is we try to harness the power of the immune system in order to improve survival and prevent recurrence in individuals. Now, vaccines have been used a long time in cancers. And some of you may have followed those, and they've just got a bum rap, because part of the problem is we didn't know how they were going to behave. So 20 years ago, when we started putting these these vaccines into people, it was in very end-stage patients with a lot of metastatic burden. Why does the tumor grow out even though you have an immune system? Because tumors are very inclined to develop local immune suppression that can prevent the development of disease. Infectious diseases do the same thing. That's why we vaccinate, in order to prevent disease. We don't vaccinate to treat disease. That's the importance here. So now we've shifted in how we've used vaccines into disease prevention. I'm going to give you some examples of that and just go through just a few studies very briefly, and we can answer questions later. But I wanted to spend most of the time talking about the power of the immune system. And so there's a number of different antigenic approaches. This is very complicated. In fact, some of this I don't even quite understand how it works, because it's very molecular, and I'm a translational biologist, and I try to think of these things, and then I ask the molecular biologist to help me craft and carve. It represents a team effort, a number of different individuals at all levels to get to where we're at. So we're developing new drugs and new strategies for patients with cancer. We can attack in breast cancer microbial antigen, viruses, bacteria, and everything, but we can't find anything. We found it for, cervical cancer? We found it for liver cancer, but we can't find anything that causes breast cancer like that. So we can't target microbial antigens. We could attack all these mutations that people are talking about in the mainstream media, but breast cancer doesn't have a lot of those mutations. And it certainly, in early cases of disease, doesn't have a lot of those mutations. There's other explanations for why breast cancers grow despite mutations in the DNA. We can target self-antigens, and that's been our approach. Well, isn't that going to cause autoimmunity? It doesn't cause autoimmunity. We figured that out. Normal proteins in your body, very complex slide, actually result in the presentation of different fragments of proteins that make the tumor look different than normal tissue, okay? We can train your body's immune system to look for abnormalities. And these abnormalities don't have to come from viruses, they don't have to come from bacteria, they can come from changes in the way the tumor is compared to normal tissues. And so this is a perfect example here. So we generated some what we call HER2/neu positive T cells, very potent T cells, can wipe out a tumor cell. You can see here, I'm not going to go into all this data, but you can see here they can directly kill over time a large percentage of the tumor cells. And we take a normal cell that produces a little bit of this antigen. In this case, it's a cardiac myocyte, and we can see that there's no killing. This is proof that we can really dissect the immune system, understand the abnormalities in cancer, put those in a vaccine, and target that vaccine. So we've done this. We started out, this was a long time ago when I first started. I showed this in animal models where we could immunize and protect against cancer development, and we have not stopped in our quest in order to figure out ways to do this in humans. We started with some very, very old, antique ways of trying to understand these abnormalities. And so these are abnormal, this red here is abnormal proteins from the cancers. So trying to understand those and how those are different from humans. And we came up with several vaccines, and we actually tested some of those vaccines to really establish the field. We didn't know if it was the best. And they aren't being used anymore because they're very old. Except for in Tampa, a colleague of mine is using them, and he's seen about 30% of DCIS lesions shrinking just with vaccines alone. 30%. So we can do something with these vaccines. I've since moved on and developed other vaccines. This is one example of one of the companies that was on the conflict of interest page. Individuals that are immunized and develop immune responses, which are those individuals shown here above this red line, they have immune responses, have less relapses. All of the relapses in this particular clinical trial and shown here in red happened in patients that didn't have that immune response. These work. We need to figure out how to get them into people. We need to figure out how to immunize everybody that has been diagnosed and treated with cancer. We need to figure that out. And that's what we're trying to do. It's not that easy. It sounds, easy, but it's not. And so we use very sophisticated mathematical modeling. This is just a table to show mathematical modeling, trying to come up with all of these different regions of the immune system and the proteins on tumor cells that we can target. So we did that, and we came up with a number of different vaccines. So here we have a vaccine. This is HER2/neu, which is a protein on the outside of some breast cancer cells. And we came up with a number of different abnormal regions that the immune system could see, and we developed a vaccine. And we showed, lo and behold, people didn't think we could do this. We could generate immune responses against a self-protein safely in individuals by understanding the complexities of cancer, the abnormalities of cancer, how the immune system works. So we've gone on to receive several grants that have allowed us to go to the next step. We can do all the phase 1 trials that we can do. But ultimately, we need to do advanced clinical trials, immunizing people at risk for the development of cancer in order to understand. We recently received a grant from the Department of Defense for $4 million to try to develop a vaccine that can treat and eliminate cancer so that patients don't have to have surgery and radiation and chemotherapy. And this is being tried right now at the Mayo Clinic. We're starting off with DCIS, which is a very early form of breast cancer. We know that this monoclonal antibody trastuzumab, or Herceptin, that's used for the treatment of breast cancer improves survival. For many years, we didn't know why it improves survival. It improves survival because it activates the immune system. I could go through all that, but that's extremely complex. But just let me say that trastuzumab activates the immune system. Only individuals that have an activated immune system following the administration of Herceptin have better outcome. We've developed a vaccine to improve on that. We were just informed a week ago that we received an $11 million award at Mayo Clinic, so this hasn't been in the news yet, that we are now going to be permitted by the Department of Defense to conduct a large phase 2 clinical trial, 380 individuals followed long-term, trying to understand where this vaccine that we have can improve the power of the already existing monoclonal antibody Herceptin, which has relatively few side effects compared to chemotherapy. We've done this with other cancers as well. So in triple-negative breast cancer patients, without going into all of this, we've identified in these red boxes regions of proteins that are abnormal. And we've gone on to develop clinical trials. Lo and behold, again, we can immunize individuals against normal proteins in the body if we know the regions that are abnormal. And we have recently gotten a $14 million clinical trial for triple-negative breast cancer to prevent recurrence in individuals. This is ongoing. It just opened up within the last few months. So if you know individuals that can participate in these, have them contact the Mayo Clinic. So there's a number of other uses for vaccines. We've developed a number of these. And I don't have time to go over all of them. Most of them have been in the prevention setting, but we're developing new ones that can be employed with immune checkpoint blockade, which is the new therapy that is being widely touted for melanoma, non-small cell lung cancer, etc. Oftentimes, this therapy doesn't work. 80% of the time, it doesn't work very well because when we give it, it unlocks the immune system, but the immune system doesn't know where to go. Sometimes it knows where to go. I'm going to go to the cancer. I'm going to find it. So we have now vaccines that can train the immune system and can be delivered with these novel immune checkpoint blockade and improve survival. We've done this in animals that develop cancer. We see that animals that normally would die from cancer in 20 to 30 days now living half their lifetime before resuccumbing to the tumor. Very impressive. We hope to get that into the clinic soon. And I'm not going to comment on this slide, but how it does that is it stimulates the immune system. We see higher levels of immune cells that in the blood and in the body. And these immune cells travel around and they kill the tumor cells that develop. So we have a number of clinical trials that we're engaged in to answer the questions that we need to answer. Is this going to work? And we've been well funded by the Department of Defense and by this newly established vision of the pillar of immunotherapy for the treatment of cancer. So in the last 2 minutes, I have a couple of minutes left, right, Winston? Okay, in the last couple of minutes, I just want to talk about the ultimate prize here. So for 10 years, I have, in association with large advocacy organizations that consist of individuals that advocate for research funding, the National Breast Cancer Coalition. So that's people like, you and me that have had cancer, that have not had cancer, but really need to put effort into eliminating this particular burden. So we've been fortunate enough to be funded for 10 years on a think tank by the National Philanthropic Trust, which is a large trust, multi-billion-dollar with very keen interest in healthcare outcomes for people and other technologies as well. That's not all they're interested in. And they've funded us with the National Breast Cancer Coalition. We entered into a partnership, the Mayo Clinic and the National Breast Cancer Coalition and the National Philanthropic Trust, in January of 2017 to develop the world's first prevention vaccine for breast cancer. This isn't like the cancer or the vaccines for cervical cancer or infectious diseases. This is based on these novel entities that we have found that are abnormal in tumors. And so the idea and the goals are to develop a vaccine that targets all three major subsets of breast cancer, to develop a vaccine that reduces the incidence of breast cancer. If you reduce the incidence of breast cancer, you reduce the mortality from breast cancer. You reduce the morbidity from breast cancer. You reduce the social and economic costs of breast cancer. Now, I think this cancer will actually have benefit for other individuals as well, but that remains to be seen. And so we have selected the antigens, and those are those abnormal proteins that I was telling you about, right? And we sent it to the FDA. We want to develop a prevention vaccine. And so I developed a thick binder of all of the studies, not just my studies, but other people have been looking at these as well. And this is the first time that the FDA probably is challenged with this question. And, so I'm thinking the FDA is never going to allow me to do this. To generate immunity against proteins that are normally in your body, even though we showed that we could do it in a non-toxic way. And I was really surprised just last week they came back with a response saying that they would let me do it. I need money, but they would let me do it. And then I wanted to have a phone call with them, but apparently, and we were scheduled to do that yesterday afternoon, but there was a big storm in the Northeast, and so I have further comments and questions for them on Tuesday, assuming that they can get the power back on. But so very happy about that. It's a very long-term problem that we have been developing, and so I'm pleased that Mayo is going to be a partner in that process. I'm not going to go into any conclusions because I've just repeatedly told you how we use vaccines and how we target vaccines. And we didn't do that alone, right? I mean, this takes, like all novel therapies, and you're going to hear about one next. Lots of people, lots of funding, lots of advocacy, lots of legislation, lots of commitment. And I'm pleased to have worked with a number of different people here, Winston, and a number of individuals from the Mayo Clinic that are also going to be presenting today in development of these strategies. So with that, I thank you.